Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk today on these books that are in my library. Very important books, very historic books. And I wanted to talk about their story. I wanted to talk about the people who were involved with these books. I want to talk about what other copies of these books did and had an effect on. There's a lot of things I wanted to talk about. I have talked about these books before, and I have shared some of the information, but I wanted to go into this with a little bit more depth. Now, first off, one of the things that's very interesting about these books is the fact that they are the lectures of rhetoric and oratory as given by John Quincy Adams at Harvard University between 1807 and 1809. He was the Boylston Chair there on oratory, and he taught a small grouping of individuals and worked with them and gave a series. And when I say a series, we have 2 full books of lectures on oratory. And of course, he also talked about how to speak, how to perform in front of people, how to deliver, all of these things. It's a fascinating series of books here. And he taught in between the time. He was a senator, and then he had to leave because he was nominated by James Madison to become an ambassador, which he would do. And these were printed in 1810. They were printed at behest of his students, who wanted very much to have copies of his lectures. His students really enjoyed his lectures and cared a lot about Mr. Adams. In those days, this is long before he became president. This was when he was, basically about 40 years old, 40 to 42 years of age. And he had a wonderful way of speaking with these kids. And they weren't kids, I shouldn't say that. They were young men. And the books themselves were eventually published. And the only regret that John Quincy Adams had was the fact that now he's going to publish these in 1810. He didn't have time to edit them. And so they were basically as he just wrote them out. And he was not very happy about that, but he was very happy to solve the dilemma of having them available for his students. Now, many other people purchased copies of these books. Many libraries and schools probably did. It wasn't a massive publication because it's, somewhat of a narrow topic. And the ones that didn't sell, because in this publication, were brought to the old house in Quincy, the old house where John Adams and Abigail Adams lived. And a very proud father was very happy to have these many copies of his son's book. And he used these books as gifts for many individuals. Now, many people would get these books. And perhaps the greatest story of these books is a set was sent to Thomas Jefferson. And this set, which was mailed, I guess it was, New Year's Day, 1812? the set was sent to Thomas Jefferson, and it was used basically as an opportunity to repair the damage that had occurred between them and reopen their friendship. And these books were that gift. In fact, Adams called them a gift of homespun. And what did he mean by a gift of homespun? And he eventually explained to Jefferson that homespun, this was the work of his son. And that John Quincy Adams was as much Jefferson's son as he was his own, because he studied with Jefferson, and he studied with his father, and also he got to study with Benjamin Franklin. I mean, think of this phenomenal education. And of course, he also was well schooled in various centers of learning around the world. He just didn't go locally. It's pretty incredible what John Quincy Adams was able to do. And this brilliant young man had written these books, and he would write many books, but these were the books that opened up that relationship with Adams and Jefferson and started them writing letters to each other until their deaths. I don't have to go into detail what happened between Adams and Jefferson. We all know that story with politics. These books have a very important history of their own, because the individual who owned these books was William Stephen Smith. And if that name doesn't mean anything to you, that's understandable. But William Stephen Smith is very important in the history of the American Revolution. He was the aide-de-camp to many famous generals. He was the aide-de-camp to Lafayette, and eventually aide-de-camp to George Washington. He became extremely close to George Washington, and Washington, like he did with several of his young officers, looked to them almost like sons. In fact, he used to share his tent with Smith. I mean, that was a great honor on Smith's part. And Smith, of course, served wonderfully during the American Revolution. Was written up many times with great honor by George Washington on his conduct and during the war. Smith also, afterwards, was very much involved with George Washington in a friendship. He visited Mount Vernon. Also, he became one of the early nominees to be sent to Europe as aides to ambassadors in diplomacy. And there were many young men who got involved in this. Another was James Maury, who wasn't as young, but he was involved as well, and actually Smith and Maury became rather friendly in their conversations. Now, who was Maury? James Maury was a close personal friend of Thomas Jefferson's. And in fact, Jefferson and Maury went to school together. I think Maury was born around 1746, and he lived till 1840, and lived an amazingly long life. And so he was 9 years older than Smith. But their friendship would start around those days, and it'll be an interesting part in these books as we get along here. Now, Smith was in Europe. He eventually became part of the team under the ambassadorship of John Adams. And during this time, while he was working with Adams, he became the courier of letters written between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson was an ambassador in France, and Paris, I should say, Paris, France. And of course, Adams was in London, England. And so he would go back and forth and spend several days with Jefferson, then come back and spend back more time with Adams. And Jefferson wrote Adams and said, "There's a room always available for William Smith." And they had wonderful conversations, and they wrote letters to each other, etc. It was, at this time, Benjamin Franklin was heading back to the United States, and Jefferson took over. Another thing that's rather fascinating at this time, while he was in Europe, he also started courting John Adams' daughter. And William Smith eventually marries Abby and becomes part of the Adams family. He also took a little vacation at times and went to Russia, where he met Frederick the Great, which is pretty amazing, and became a correspondent with him and spent some time with him. He was amazingly well-traveled and had a coterie of various individuals which he was friendly with. Upon the return of the Adams family from London, England in 1788, of course, William Smith was with them when they returned. And of course, shortly afterwards, John Adams would be named the Vice President of the United States in 1789. At this point, George Washington had come to William Smith and said, "I need you, and I want you to be part of my administration." And he made Smith the Marshal of New York City. Now, there were things that Smith had done previously that kind of had an effect on Washington. Smith was in charge of Evacuation Day in New York. He was the fellow in charge of the event, seeing the English off and seeing Washington and his troops in. He was also one of the founders and the second president of the Society of Cincinnati, which still exists. And he was the second president of that, was very much involved in it, gave a number of speeches there, and was there with many of the people he had served with during the American Revolution. You got to understand something. With William Smith, he knew so many people, and he was involved with so many people. He was intimately involved with Washington, intimately involved with John Adams, and quite intimate with John Quincy Adams. He also knew Thomas Jefferson quite well. He knew James Madison, James Monroe. He knew Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, and countless others of the time of the American Revolution. So it's really amazing when you think about these books. And you may wonder, all these papers in here. This is where Smith put in marginalia and wrote in the books. And I have that all together here so I can keep track of it. A few more things to go through here. William Smith went through some amazing times. I mean, he had an incredible early life. But later in life, as things go along, he got involved in many things that were not at all successful. He got into land speculation, which many people did back then, but in his case it was not successful. And he lost everything, which caused a lot of problems. He tried very hard to find ways of kind of correcting it, making money. He even got involved in a scheme which was kind of put together by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to go on an investigating trip with ships to possibly take over some property, which didn't work over very well. In fact, it went over so badly, it was a disaster. And I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into this whole story because it would take a month of Sundays for me to explain it. Nonetheless, he was arrested. His son was almost killed, but he escaped, and he returned to the United States as well. Several people were lost. And Smith announced that he had done this at the behest of Thomas Jefferson. And this is where the relationship between him and Jefferson ends. It already kind of ended already with the breakup between Adams and Jefferson. And of course, Smith was basically an Adams. And when he went to court over this whole event and tried for many different charges, Thomas Jefferson announced that no one from his administration can be questioned by the court, which is rather mysterious if you think about it. It's almost like announcing guilt. And of course, Smith said, I did this because Jefferson wanted me to do this. I think he was kind of set up by Jefferson to a degree. And Jefferson did this with several people. But the courts realized that there was something very radically wrong here, and he was acquitted. He was found not guilty because they noticed there was something radically wrong in Jefferson's responses. But this destroyed Smith totally. And his career was pretty ruined after that. And he never seemed to gain the luster he once had. He was attacked quite strongly early on, going back to about shortly in the 1790s when he had the land speculation problems, by Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton tried to come up with various laws in New York saying if you didn't have enough money or something like that, you could not hold office. It's interesting to note that Alexander Hamilton would eventually not have any money, but he didn't like that idea to be put toward him. A few more things to mention with these books. These were Smith's, William Stephen Smith's. He was given these by John Adams. And of course, he kept these. And he did serve in the House of Representatives in Washington. And these books came with him. And in 1816, he was dying. And he wrote in these books that he wanted these books to go to James Mowry. Now, of course, as I mentioned, James Mowry, good friend of Thomas Jefferson. At this point, of course, Adams and Jefferson had rekindled their friendship. And so it was perfectly fine to do such a thing. And so I am anticipating, but I can't prove it, that these went to James Mowry. That's what he wrote. I don't know if it happened. I'm hoping it did. And of course, James Mowry lived to 1840. After that, the story on these goes cold. I don't know where they were, but where they initially were and who initially had them is so amazingly interesting and important. Their provenance is so incredible. And you know, the interesting thing as well, you know, for me, I am so touched with history. I love history. And there are things about like being able to hold these books because I know where they were. And I know who they heard. They heard the voice of John Adams and Abigail Adams and Smith and probably countless other individuals that are so important in our history. These are the treasures, one of the great treasures in my library. And one of the things I have to think of is where do they go when I basically assume room temperature? I've been thinking about it. I thought that perhaps it might be a great thing that they should go to the Society of Cincinnati, since Smith was one of its founders and its second president, and they have a library. I've often thought also that maybe the Adams Historic Site in Quincy maybe should get these, because of course he was in the Adams family, and John Adams, who took a rather negative look at Smith for a while, eventually changed his tune after about 1812 and started writing some fascinating things about Smith and how much he admired him and wished him well. But where will these end up? I don't know. But it is something that I've been thinking of, that who should get these, because they are far too historic to just sit on a shelf, after I'm gone. For now, they will keep me company. For now, I will look to these fondly, and I read these books. It's fascinating to read what John Quincy Adams wrote. I'm always looking through this and always learning, because you got to remember, to end this, John Quincy Adams was one of the greatest intellects that this country produced, if you think about it. In the presidency, I don't think he has any equal. But I guess I have talked long enough here, and I can't get over the amazing chance that these found their way to me. And I acquired these books a number of years ago, but I didn't know their history. I didn't know who owned them until I started reading through the book. And then suddenly, it all made sense. And that history became part of my history, as they have spent time with me, as they spent time with John Adams, as they spent time with William Stephen Smith, and hopefully spent some time with James Mowry. And here they are with Jack Stanley. And just imagine where they may be next, and who will look at these and hold these, and what person who is important in our history will look at these, touch these, and these will hear their voice. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this. It's something I wanted to do and talk about these books, because history is such an important thing, and we don't do enough to talk about our history and share our history. And I guess that's enough for me. I've talked enough. Thank you.